The sizzle of bacon barely cut through the hush. Forks clinked against ceramic. A soft hum from the jukebox played something old and slow, the kind of tune that wrapped around the walls like smoke. Benjamin Walker sat in his usual booth, third from the window, sipping plain black coffee from a chipped mug he used every morning. 81 years on this earth, and he hadn't missed a sunrise at this diner in 7. His hands shook gently, but not from fear. The man had worn medals on his chest and buried friends in foreign soil. In here, though, he was just Ben, quiet, polite, predictable. But peace doesn't always wait for the check. The man at the counter was loud, early 30s, arms puffed up like his ego, barking at the waitress about overcooked eggs. She was young, new to the job, and her voice kept shrinking with every insult. When she turned to walk away, the man slammed his hand on the counter, drawing every eye in the room. Every eye except Benjamin's. His stayed steady, calm, unimpressed. "You don't have to be cruel just to get attention," Benjamin said, not loud, but clear enough. The thug turned, and without a moment of thought or reason, walked up and slapped the veteran across the face. Hard. The sound rang out like a dropped plate. The waitress gasped. Someone's coffee spoon hit the floor. No one moved. Benjamin didn't get up, didn't curse, just touched the corner of his lip, felt the blood, and blinked slowly. His hand trembled, but not out of fear. He had fought men with guns and lived to tell the tale. But this moment, this silence, it bruised more than bone. No one stood up for him. No one said a word. They just looked away. The waitress looked like she wanted to scream but couldn't. Instead, she clutched a plate of hash browns with shaking hands, halfway between the kitchen and the floor. And then, like thunder after too much quiet, the bell above the diner door rang. Boots stepped across linoleum with precision. A shadow fell through the doorway. A man in a jet black suit stood at the threshold, fedora in hand, flanked by 4 other men built like they were carved out of silence. He didn't need to speak. The diner changed temperature. At the center of them was a man with a worn beard and ink down both arms. He didn't smile, didn't blink, just looked across the room until his eyes landed on the old man in the booth with blood on his lip. Richard McDaniel. 16 years gone. Not a letter, not a call. But there he stood, older now, colder too, and yet those eyes were still his mother's. Benjamin's chest tightened, but he didn't speak. The thug was laughing to himself near the counter, still riding the high of cowardice. But as the silence deepened, his grin faltered. Slowly, he turned. His confidence met the eyes of 5 very quiet, very dangerous men. The one in the center, the one in the suit, took the plate from the waitress without a word, walked it to Benjamin's booth, and gently set it down. Then he stepped back. And Richard stepped forward. Before we continue, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. The door swung shut behind them, letting out a soft click that echoed louder than the slap had. The men fanned into the diner with quiet precision, not rowdy, not aggressive, just presence. Their tailored black suits caught the glint of overhead lights, sharp edges cutting clean lines through the soft haze of fried eggs and shame. Even the air shifted, thickening with something unspeakable, a gravity the room wasn't prepared for. The customers who had once stared at their coffee cups now risked glances, eyes bouncing off dark silk, slick shoes, and unreadable faces. Renato Arcuri stood at the center of it all, hat in hand, suit pressed so tight it looked like it had never known a wrinkle. He didn't need to speak. His silence did the heavy lifting. Every man behind him stood like a bodyguard and a statue, muscle coiled under discipline. Patrons shrunk in their seats, some pretending to check their phones, others pretending not to breathe. Even the jukebox, midway through a soulful ballad, skipped a beat and went dead quiet. The thug, the same one who had struck Benjamin, cocked his head, his earlier bravado fraying at the edges. He tried to puff his chest again, but it didn't land the same this time. His smirk flickered, eyes darting between the 5 men like he was doing mental math he didn't understand. The waitress still stood frozen mid-aisle, her plate wobbling in her hands, caught between a breakfast order and a battlefield. One of the suited men gently relieved her of the plate, setting it down on the counter like it was a sacred offering. Then he stepped aside, and Richard McDaniel stepped forward. The tattoos up Richard's arm peeked through the rolled cuff of his pressed white shirt, a stark contrast against the fresh shave and clean lines. His beard had grown thicker than Benjamin remembered, but his eyes, those eyes hadn't changed. A chill ran through Benjamin's bones, not from fear, but from recognition carved deep in the marrow of time. 16 years had passed since that face had stood before him. 16 years without answers, phone calls, apologies, or need. Richard's gaze flicked to the blood at the corner of Benjamin's mouth, and his jaw tightened. It wasn't just anger, it was something older, heavier, made of grief and ash. There was a pause in him, a tension between guilt and the kind of fury that turns quiet men into storms. But the storm didn't rise. He just took one slow breath and looked around the diner like a wolf sniffing for weakness. Benjamin didn't say anything. He couldn't. Words had never been their strong suit, not when Richard was 16, not when he left home, and not now, when the boy had returned wrapped in shadows and silence. His throat felt like it was full of cement. All he could do was watch his son cross the room like a man carrying the weight of 2 lifetimes. The thug's voice, finally cracking under the silence, piped up like a firecracker in a funeral. "What is this?" he scoffed, louder than necessary. "You need your little funeral crew to back you up, old man?" His words hung in the air like smoke, but they had no fire behind them. No one laughed. No one moved. Renato Arcuri took a single step forward, not rushed, not aggressive, but deliberate. He placed Benjamin's untouched breakfast gently on the table, then stood tall beside Richard, resting his hat against his chest like he was paying respects at a graveside. His voice, when it finally came, was a thing made of velvet and steel. "You put your hand on a man who bled for this country," he said softly. "And you did it in front of his son." It wasn't a threat. It was a judgment, final, echoing, almost holy in its simplicity. The thug swallowed, eyes flitting now with real panic, fingers twitching like they wanted to grip something solid. But there was no solid ground left. Not in a room where ghosts wore suits and grief carried muscle. Benjamin's lips parted slightly, but still no words came. It wasn't fear, it was something more complicated, like trying to breathe underwater after decades above the surface. Richard glanced at him only briefly before returning his focus to the man who had struck his father. He didn't move toward him. He didn't need to. The other Mafia men, 3 of them now standing in perfect formation near the exit, didn't twitch, didn't threaten, didn't flinch. They didn't have to. The power in the room didn't come from weapons or words. It came from reputation. From the quiet way Renato stood without blinking. From the history stitched into Richard's silence. "I asked you something," the thug snapped again, though weaker this time. His voice cracked at the end, like a boy caught in a lie too big to hide. "You got something to say, old man?" he added, this time to Benjamin. But Benjamin still said nothing. It was Richard who finally spoke. Not loudly. Not for the crowd. Just loud enough for the thug to hear and remember. "You put your hand on my father," he said. "And the only reason you'll keep that hand is because he's still decent enough to believe you're not worth losing my soul over." The diner went silent again. This time, it was a sacred silence. The kind that follows thunder. The thug's chest rose and fell faster now. His bravado had left the building long before his body would. He looked to the other customers for help, for witnesses, for anyone who might stop what felt inevitable. But no one was coming. They had already chosen their side. Benjamin stared at Richard for a long moment. A man with nothing to say and everything to feel. Years of disappointment. Years of silence. Years of wondering if his son was dead or worse, forgotten him. And yet, here he stood. Not a boy anymore. Not even really a man. Something else entirely, something the world didn't have words for. Renato placed a hand on Richard's shoulder, nodding once. The message was clear. They had made their point. The choice was now in Richard's hands. Power, real power, wasn't in who could throw the first punch. It was in who didn't have to. With one last look at the thug, Richard turned his back, a move more disrespectful than any threat. Then he sat across from his father, same booth, same seat he hadn't touched in 16 years. His fingers brushed against the rim of Benjamin's coffee cup like he was looking for something familiar. Benjamin looked at his son, truly looked at him, and something in his chest finally began to thaw. Across the room, the thug backed away, step by step, never turning his back to the men in black. His mouth opened again, maybe for an apology, maybe for another excuse, but no one was listening anymore. The room had moved on. The people who had watched a man get hit and done nothing were now watching a man return and do everything. And in that moment, in that booth, between the silence and the weight of time, a father and son breathed the same air again. The diner faded around Benjamin as the weight of memory pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat. He sat across from his son, but it was the past that pulled at him, years lined up like old soldiers in formation. His lip still bore the sting of the slap, but that wasn't what made his hands tremble. It was the man before him, grown, hardened, changed, yet unmistakably his boy. For a moment, Benjamin wasn't sitting in a diner anymore. He was back in a different silence. The war had ended long before Richard was born, but Benjamin never quite returned home from it. His body came back, sure, but some parts of him, the parts that knew how to say, "I love you," or "I'm proud," stayed buried somewhere across the ocean. He raised his son like a soldier, not a child, mistaking strictness for strength and silence for safety. He gave orders instead of affection, routines instead of reassurances. Back then, he thought he was preparing Richard for the world. But the world Richard stepped into didn't care for medals or routines. It was chaos in a leather jacket, full of flashing lights, hard corners, and fast cash. By the time Benjamin realized his boy had stopped coming home after school, the gap between them had already widened into something unspoken and steep. They had arguments, always short, always sharp, mostly about nothing and everything at once. And one day, Richard didn't come back at all. Benjamin didn't chase him. Pride has a way of locking doors from both sides. He told himself it was discipline, that if he chased the boy now, Richard would never respect him. But the truth was, Benjamin didn't know how to reach for someone without barking an order. So he waited days, weeks, years, hoping his silence would be interpreted as strength, not absence. When the phone rang 3 years later, it wasn't Richard's voice on the other end. It was the police. They said his son had been picked up for car theft and asked if he had someone who could post bail. Benjamin said no, his voice calm, his heart cracking. That night, he sat on the front porch for 4 hours in the dark, listening to crickets and regret. The next time he saw Richard was at his mother's funeral. The boy, no, the man now, stood at the back of the chapel in a black shirt and sunglasses, saying nothing. Benjamin didn't speak to him. Couldn't. They sat 2 rows apart but felt countries away. And when the service ended, Richard disappeared before Benjamin could think of what to say. Years passed in slow silence. Benjamin stopped leaving town, stopped going to the hardware store, stopped trying to explain to neighbors where his son had gone. He drank his coffee at the same diner each morning because it was quiet and no one asked him questions. He got older, slower, and somewhere along the way, he stopped believing Richard would ever return. Until today. Now, across from him sat a man with the weight of his own battles in his eyes. Richard looked like the kind of person Benjamin used to salute, dangerous, composed, and full of ghosts. He didn't look like the boy who used to sneak cookies after lights out or ask a million questions during baseball games. Benjamin wanted to say something, anything, but every word felt like a landmine. So he sat in the silence, his mouth dry, his chest heavy. He tried to remember the last thing he had said to Richard before he left home. It wasn't "I love you." It wasn't "be careful." It was something about growing up and being a man. Something about how the world didn't owe him softness. But now, with blood drying on his lip and his grown son staring at him across a chipped diner table, he wondered if it had ever been the world he was trying to harden Richard against or himself. Richard still hadn't spoken. He didn't look angry. Just present. Grounded. As if he had rehearsed this moment in his head so many times it had stopped being real. Benjamin couldn't help but wonder how much of the man before him he had missed while clinging to principle. In all those years apart, Benjamin had consoled himself with discipline. He woke at 6 o'clock every day, mowed the lawn twice a week, ironed his shirts whether or not he wore them. He convinced himself that if he remained steady, Richard would come back to something solid. But now, sitting across from his son and realizing how hollow that steadiness had become, he felt like a statue that had outlived its meaning. A part of him wanted to reach across the table, to grab his son's hand, to say, "I'm sorry I didn't know how to love you" out loud. But the habit of restraint was decades deep. It had calcified into a kind of internal armor, and right now he wasn't sure how to take it off. The room around them moved in slow motion. Forks clinked, plates scraped, but no one dared interrupt the gravity of the moment. Even Renato and his men stood back, giving them space like mourners at a graveside. Something sacred was unfolding, not loud, not violent, but undeniably seismic. Benjamin's lip quivered. Not from pain, but from the rising tide of everything he had never said. He blinked hard and tried to swallow the ache in his throat. But it stayed lodged there, thick as memory. He wondered how many years he had wasted building walls when bridges were what his son needed. And then Richard did something Benjamin wasn't prepared for. He looked down, almost shyly, and said, "You still take your coffee black?" Benjamin stared at him. That was it. No blame. No accusations. Just a quiet observation, a thread tossed gently across the divide. His voice, when it came, was cracked and small. Every morning. A pause. "I guess some things don't change." Richard offered the faintest smile. "And some do." They sat in silence again. But this time, it wasn't the kind that stung. It was the kind that lets things settle. That makes room for breath. Benjamin's lip quivered again, but this time, he let it. Let the shame rise. Let the sorrow sit. Let the man he had become reckon with the man he never knew how to be. Have you ever wanted to say something to someone you love, but didn't know how? What stopped you, and what would you say now if you had the chance? If this story moved something in you, subscribe to the channel and join a community that believes in second chances, not just in stories, but in life. The silence between them stretched like an old bridge, weathered, cracked, but still somehow standing. Benjamin's fingers curled around the edge of his coffee cup, unsure of whether to raise it or release it. Richard leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table like he used to when he was a boy asking for another slice of pie. But this wasn't pie, and this wasn't then. This was two men sitting across from everything they never said. "Dad," Richard said. One word. That was all. But it landed like a match in dry grass, lighting up the space between them with heat that wasn't fire. It was something older, more aching. Benjamin's lip trembled again, and he coughed softly to steady it, not from the slap, but from the swell in his chest. He hadn't heard that word in over a decade. "I didn't expect," Benjamin began, then stopped, the words dissolving like sugar in hot coffee. He wasn't sure what he meant to say. "Expect to see you? Expect to survive this long? Expect to still matter to you?" Richard waited, not pushing, just listening the way only someone raised on silence could. It was Benjamin who broke the pause again. "You came." Richard nodded once. "I saw the footage." Benjamin blinked. "Footage?" Richard looked toward one of the suited men near the door. "One of our guys was in the area. Sent me the video. I saw him hit you." Benjamin looked down at his hand resting on the table. The bruise was still forming, just below the cheekbone, but the real bruise was somewhere deeper. "Didn't think you'd come running just for that." "I didn't come running," Richard said. "I came home." That word home made Benjamin's throat tighten all over again. It wasn't just sentiment. It was something heavier, something that crawled under the ribs and stayed there. He couldn't say "I'm glad you did." His mouth wouldn't let him. So instead, he just gave a small, tired nod. The tension around the table began to settle, but the diner hadn't forgotten how it started. At the far end near the counter, the The thug who had struck Benjamin sat with his arms folded, trying to reclaim the last scrap of control he thought he still had. He scoffed loud enough for the room to hear. "What is this?" he said, smirking at the table. "Family therapy?" The words didn't carry bravado anymore. They felt desperate, like a last match strike in a room soaked in gasoline. Richard didn't flinch. He just turned his head, slow and deliberate, eyes locking onto the man like a wolf spotting something that wasn't worth the hunt, but might still need putting down. Renato Arcuri moved before anyone else did. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise his hand. He simply stepped forward from where he'd been standing beside the jukebox, sliding his hat beneath one arm like a funeral director preparing a eulogy. The light caught the gray at his temples, making his presence feel even older than it was, not in years, but in weight. And when he spoke, it was like the room leaned in to hear. "You don't speak when men like these are trying to remember what it means to be family," he said, voice smooth but sharp. "You listen. You learn. Or you leave." The thug opened his mouth again, but Renato raised one finger, not high, not rushed, just a quiet gesture that said, "You've had your turn." And the man shut it. Behind him, two of Renato's men shifted slightly, not threatening, just reminding. The kind of presence that didn't need to be explained. Benjamin exhaled softly, but his shoulders were still tight. He didn't like being defended, not even by someone like Renato. But he couldn't deny what it felt like to not be alone for once, to not have to hold the line by himself. Richard turned back to him, the corner of his mouth twitching, not quite a smile, but something close. "I didn't plan what to say," Richard admitted. Benjamin gave a dry chuckle. "Good. I wouldn't know how to handle it." Richard looked down, tracing a finger along a crack in the table's laminate surface. "I was angry for a long time," he said. "Thought you chose duty over me. Thought you'd be proud if I joined the military. But when you didn't even show up to graduation." Benjamin winced like the memory hit him physically. "I didn't know how to be proud without sounding like I was just giving orders." His voice cracked then. "By the time I realized what I'd lost, you were already gone." "I didn't want your pride," Richard said. "I wanted your presence." The sentence lingered, sitting heavy between them like a third man at the table. Benjamin looked away, out the window, where the sky had shifted to a pale gray. "When your mother passed, I thought you might come home." His voice dropped. "When you didn't, I figured I'd buried both of you." "I was there," Richard said. "Back of the chapel. Couldn't face you." The image hit Benjamin like a cold gust. He remembered the feeling of being watched, of something unspoken hanging in the air that day. "I wish you had." "I didn't think I was allowed to." The words weren't bitter. They were honest, raw, and simple. And they sliced deeper than any slap ever could. Benjamin reached for his napkin again, not for the blood this time, but for the emotion crawling up through his eyes. "I spent so long thinking silence was strength," he said quietly. "Turns out it was just cowardice dressed in camouflage." Richard didn't respond. He didn't have to. Sometimes presence is the answer. Across the diner, no one dared interrupt the weight of what was being unearthed. The air felt reverent, as if something sacred had started to bloom in a place known for burnt toast and lukewarm coffee. Renato stood watch like a sentinel, half priest, half judge, ensuring nothing shattered this fragile, long-awaited peace. And then, without ceremony or warning, Richard reached across the table and placed his hand over Benjamin's. It was rough, calloused, worn, a working man's hand. The hand of someone who had fought to survive in a world his father never truly prepared him for. But it was warm. And it stayed. Benjamin looked down at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned his own palm over and closed his fingers around his son's. The room didn't cheer. It didn't need to. Some moments were too sacred for noise. Renato Arcuri didn't like diners. The smell of grease, the worn vinyl seats, the chipped coffee cups, it reminded him too much of the early days when he had nothing but rage and ambition in his pockets. But he came anyway. Not for the food. For the boy who had once made a decision most grown men would have run from. Richard McDaniel had walked into Renato's life 6 years ago, like most people didn't, quietly. No fanfare. No favor-seeking. Just a call to one of Renato's men, followed by a location drop and 3 words, "He's with me." That night, Renato's nephew, bound and bleeding in the back of a stolen van, was returned home because Richard had risked everything to cut a deal that could have cost him his life. He'd done it not for money or clout, but because, as he later told Renato, some debts you pay forward. Renato had stared at him for a long moment then, trying to understand this man who operated by some unseen compass. "You don't wear the ring," Renato had said, referring to the signet most of his inner circle carried. Richard just shrugged. Didn't need to. Respect didn't come easy in Renato's world. It wasn't earned with words or flexed with muscle, it was built in actions taken when no one else is looking. And when a man like Richard risked everything to protect someone he didn't owe, well, that was something even the coldest boss noticed. Over time, Richard became something rare, not family by blood, but family by choice. And in this world, that sometimes counted more. So when the footage hit Renato's inbox, a grainy diner cam showing an old man being struck across the face while no one intervened, it barely held his attention. Until he saw Richard's name in the subject line. Then he paused, watched it again. And when he saw the old man's face, broken, silent, dignified, something in his chest stirred. Because Renato knew that kind of silence. The kind that doesn't come from weakness, but from having survived too much to flinch. He saw it in his grandfather, the day the Germans marched past their town without a word. He saw it in the mirror the day his father disappeared and never came home. And he saw it now in the man Richard called father. When Richard asked for backup, Renato didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions, didn't calculate risk, didn't weigh optics. Family called, you showed up. Even if you didn't understand the whole story, you trusted the man telling it. And Renato trusted Richard. So he put on the suit, called the crew, and drove with them in silence through the gray morning. He watched the trees blur past and remembered his own father's words, "Real men don't posture. They protect." By the time they pulled into the diner's lot, Renato wasn't thinking about optics or power. He was thinking about legacy. Legacy was a sacred thing. Money fades, muscles weaken, empires fall, but legacy? Legacy echoes. Legacy gets whispered in diners long after the suits have gone. So when they walked in and saw Benjamin Walker's bruised face and steady eyes, Renato felt something ancient shift into place. He didn't speak at first. He simply took the plate from the trembling waitress and placed it in front of the old man with quiet reverence. Then he stood at Richard's side like a wall of old stone. And when the thug dared open his mouth again, Renato delivered his truth. Violence is for fools. Legacy? That's power. The words didn't raise the room's volume. They lowered its heartbeat. You could feel it, a collective inhale that no one dared let out. The thug, still seated at the counter, blinked like he'd been slapped harder than Benjamin ever was. But Renato hadn't laid a finger on him. He didn't need to. Because in places like this, places with eggs and burnt coffee and forgotten men, power looked like silence backed by loyalty. The kind of loyalty that didn't show up late. The kind that didn't wait for applause. It just came when it mattered. And right now, it mattered more than most things. Renato gave a subtle nod to his men. They adjusted their stance, not aggressively, just enough to make their presence known. One leaned against the jukebox, another by the door, a third casually examining the sugar dispenser. But the message was clear. This place? It's watched now. The thug shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence now leaking from his collar like sweat. He wasn't cornered by fists. He was cornered by principle, a kind the streets never taught him. He could run, sure. But shame runs faster. Renato looked at him one last time, almost like a disappointed teacher. You hit a man who already did your fighting for you, he said. And you did it because he told you to be kind. The thug looked down. He didn't speak again. Turning back, Renato's eyes landed on Benjamin and Richard, their hands now resting palm to palm across the booth. There was something holy in that, not religious, but sacred nonetheless. 2 generations, broken and mending in plain sight. He'd seen vendettas start with less. But this was redemption. Renato straightened his tie, stepping back into his quiet posture, letting the moment belong to them. This wasn't his story. He was just a witness to a reunion that never should have taken this long to happen. And maybe that was enough. As the other patrons slowly resumed eating, quieter now, more mindful, Renato stood guard like a statue. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The message had already been carved into the walls. Have you ever stood by someone not because they asked, but because you knew it was right? What did that moment teach you about loyalty? If you believe loyalty speaks loudest in silence, subscribe to the channel and join a space where presence still matters more than performance. For the first time in a long while, no one in the diner could meet their own reflection in the window. The fog on the glass had nothing to do with the weather, it came from shame, rising slow and steady, curling around ankles and sinking into bones. The room hadn't moved when Benjamin was struck, and now it couldn't move from what that said about them. Forks rested midair, coffee cooled untouched, and not even the clatter of a dropped spoon could shake the thick, collective guilt that settled like dust. The slap may have been one man's hand, but the silence? That belonged to everyone. Jenny, the waitress, stood near the soda fountain, arms wrapped around herself like a girl lost in a storm. She'd frozen earlier, not because she didn't care, but because her body just locked. One moment she was balancing a plate of eggs, and the next, she was trying to swallow the lump in her throat that felt like cowardice. Benjamin had always called her Miss Jenny, even though she was barely 23. And yet when he was hit, all she could do was stand there like furniture. She kept replaying the sound in her head, the sharp, wet crack of palm on cheek. It haunted her more than the silence that followed, because in that sound was history, age, sacrifice, and a town that looked away. She should have said something. Should have dropped the plate and stood in front of him like she'd always imagined she would for someone who mattered. But instead, she did nothing. And now the silence felt louder than the slap ever had. Near the back, old Mr. Langley stirred his coffee with the same spoon he'd used for 20 years. He'd served on the town council once, long before politics became theater, and always claimed to respect veterans. But he hadn't moved when Benjamin was hit. He'd looked down at his hash browns, cheeks flushed, hoping someone else would say something first. Now he couldn't even bring himself to sip his drink. At the booth by the window, the Curtis twins, always dressed in matching blazers and cologne too strong for polite company, whispered to each other. They liked to believe they were pillars of the community. They donated to the Rotary, sponsored the summer fair, posed for newspaper spreads with cheesy smiles and thumbs-up signs. But when the slap rang out, they had shrunk like leaves in wind. One of them even chuckled nervously, as if laughing might make it less real. Across from them, Mara Belding sat rigid in her seat, two children by her side coloring menus with crayons. She'd taught civics for 22 years. Told her students that justice was the heartbeat of democracy. But in that moment, she had pulled her kids close, lowered her head, and pretended the sound came from a dropped tray. The lesson she taught that morning had no chalkboard, only silence. This town had once been the kind that saluted its elders, held doors open, remembered birthdays without reminders. It used to gather for pie auctions and pancake breakfasts, send casseroles when someone passed. But somewhere between rising mortgages and faster Wi-Fi, it had forgotten the value of its roots. Forgotten men like Benjamin Walker, who lived quietly, asked for nothing, and carried the weight of other people's freedoms on his shoulders. He was invisible until blood made him visible again. The diner, once just a morning stop for locals with nowhere urgent to be, had transformed. It wasn't neutral anymore. It had become a kind of courtroom, the kind that didn't need gavels or lawyers, just presence and choice. The people inside were witnesses, yes, but more importantly, they were jurors of themselves. And every one of them now had to reckon with what they did not do. Jenny wiped the same section of the counter for the 5th time, hands shaking, eyes blurred. She remembered once when Benjamin had stayed late to help her mop after a pipe burst near the restrooms. He hadn't said much, just rolled up his sleeves and nodded. No one else had offered. And yet today, when he needed someone to stand up, she had stayed rooted to the floor. Guilt is a funny thing. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits next to you, sipping your coffee, whispering what you already know. And the truth was, they had all failed him. Not with fists, but with silence. The Curtis twins stood to leave, but found themselves pausing at the door. Neither reached for the handle. They glanced back at Benjamin's booth, where Richard still sat with his father, hand still resting on top of his. One of the twins whispered, "We should have done something." The other only nodded. Mara reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. She left a tip that was double her bill, not because money could fix what had happened, but because it was all she could do in that moment. Her kids looked up at her, confused, sensing the shift. "Are we in trouble?" her daughter asked. "No," Mara whispered, "but maybe we should be." Jenny finally found the courage to walk over. Not to Benjamin, she wasn't ready for that yet, but to Richard. Her voice was soft, her words careful. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have done something. He deserves better." Richard didn't respond with a lecture or cold stare. He just nodded, eyes calm but unreadable. "Then be better," he said. "That's all that matters now." Outside, word was already spreading. Someone had filmed the incident. It was on social media within the hour, grainy footage, but clear enough. The old man, the slap, the silence. And then, the suits. The comments were a mix of outrage and shame. Some asked how a town could let that happen. Others praised the men in black, not knowing their names but feeling their weight. And sprinkled between them were quiet confessions from locals who had been there, trying to explain why they hadn't moved. But no explanation would erase the fact that this town had forgotten one of its own. And now it had to live with that. Not just today, not just in the headlines, but every morning Benjamin walked back into that diner. Because some moments don't get buried. They get remembered. And this one? This one had been carved into the soul of the place. The thug hadn't moved since the last time anyone dared look directly at him. He sat hunched over the counter, eyes flicking between the coffee cup in front of him and the quiet booth behind him, the one that now held more weight than he could pretend to ignore. His earlier swagger had evaporated, but pride, especially the fragile kind, dies slow. So he cleared his throat, pushed back from the counter, and stood. Every eye in the diner shifted. Richard didn't react right away. He stayed seated, calm, fingers still resting atop his father's hand. He didn't need to posture, men like him didn't have to. But when the thug turned and took a step closer, his shoulders squared slightly, not in threat, in readiness. The kind that comes from experience, not adrenaline. "You got a lot of nerve," the thug muttered, louder than he should have, voice rough with tension. "Coming in here with your little mafia circus like you own the place." The words dropped into the room like stones into a still pond, but this time, the ripples were cold. No one flinched. No one backed him. Richard rose slowly. The movement was fluid, deliberate, and impossibly silent, like someone stepping out of a coffin that had been sealed too long. He adjusted his cuffs with casual precision and then began walking toward the man, the space between them closing not with urgency, but with inevitability. Each step sounded louder than it was, the floor creaking beneath something heavier than just footsteps. The thug stood straighter, suddenly unsure of just how tall he really was. They stopped face to face, not inches apart, but close enough for history to breathe between them. Richard didn't blink, didn't smirk, just looked the man in the eye like he was reading the last page of a book he'd already memorized. Then his voice came low, even, carved from stone. "You hit a man who wouldn't hit you back." The thug's mouth twitched. He tried to hold his ground, but his stance was already crumbling. Richard didn't raise a hand, didn't even lean forward. He just let the words do the cutting. "That's not strength," he said. "That's rot." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full. Full of every moral that had once lived in the hearts of men who knew the difference between toughness and cruelty. Full of the eyes now watching, some in shame, some in awe, as justice chose stillness over fists. Richard took one more step forward, enough that his voice wouldn't need to rise to land like thunder. "You think you're dangerous because no one stopped you," he said. "But real danger walks quiet." The thug was breathing harder now. His arms hung stiff at his sides, unsure whether to raise or lower. Sweat broke across his forehead despite the cold draft of the diner's AC. There were no more clever lines left in him, no more smirks to wear like armor. He stood there, a boy who played at being a storm, finally realizing he'd brought a squirt gun to a flood. Then Richard leaned in. Not fast. Not theatrical. Just close enough that only the thug could hear the words and feel them. "That man is my father," Richard said, his voice so soft it could have passed for a prayer. "And the only reason you get to walk out of here is because he would still show you mercy." There was no follow-up. No shout. Just the truth, bare, immovable, unarguable. The thug's mouth opened, then closed. His chest rose and fell like it was trying to outrun the weight now pressing down on it. For a second, it looked like he might say something. But shame had already sealed his throat. He took a step back, then another. Renato didn't move. His men didn't need to. The room itself had already delivered the verdict. The thug turned, stumbled once on his heel, and made for the door like a man retreating from a grave he didn't realize he'd dug himself. The bell above the door jingled, absurdly gentle in its timing. And then he was gone. No one clapped. No one cheered. They just watched, breath held, as the last ounce of venom limped into the street. Richard exhaled slowly and turned around. Benjamin hadn't moved, still seated, still steady. But his eyes, those tired, heavy eyes, were different now. They held something they hadn't in a long time. Not relief. Not pride. Peace. Richard walked back, sat down, and returned his hand to the exact place it had been before. As if nothing had happened. As if everything had. No one spoke for a long while. The diner breathed low, careful, changed. Not just because the threat had left, but because what remained was something harder to describe. Respect. The bell above the door gave one final chime as it settled, but the sound barely registered. The air in the diner had thinned, like everyone was holding a breath no one remembered taking. With the thug gone, the space around Benjamin and Richard no longer buzzed with tension, it simmered with something else. Not danger. Not fear. Just truth waiting to be told. Richard's hand was still resting over Benjamin's. Neither had spoken since the confrontation, but the silence no longer hurt. It stretched not awkward, but necessary, like a room that had needed airing out for years. Benjamin finally shifted, his fingers tightening slightly beneath his son's. "You didn't have to come," he said, the words brittle but deliberate. Richard's eyes didn't leave his father's. "I know," he replied, quiet. "But I did." That simple exchange carried more weight than most confessions. Neither man flinched from it. "I thought you hated me," Benjamin admitted. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He was simply offering honesty the only way he knew how, flat, exposed, without ceremony. "For not stopping you, for not being what you needed." Richard looked down at the coffee between them, the surface still undisturbed. "I didn't hate you, Dad," he said. "I just stopped believing you cared enough to say anything." Benjamin's throat tightened, but he didn't let the tears rise. "Not yet. I was raised to believe that love was shown through duty. Through showing up, keeping the lights on, putting food on the table." He rubbed his temples, voice cracking. "Turns out, that wasn't enough." Richard exhaled through his nose. "You showed up in your way. I just didn't know how to read the signs." He looked up again. "But I do now." There was no bitterness in his tone, only clarity. Benjamin's gaze dropped to the table. "You became the man I didn't know how to raise." The words landed heavy, as though he'd been carrying them for years. Richard didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly, like he'd waited his whole life to hear them, and somehow knew they would come in this quiet, unpolished way. "I made mistakes," Richard said. "Big ones. Got lost in things that made me feel strong when I didn't know how to feel anything else." He took a breath. "But I never stopped wondering if you'd want me back, if I was even still your son." Benjamin's reply came without hesitation. "You never stopped being my son," he said. "Even when I couldn't find the words, even when I was too proud or too scared or too damned angry with myself to call." He paused, reaching for his napkin again, but this time not to wipe blood, only to steady his hand. "You left," he added. "But I pushed first." The space between them softened. Outside, the world continued its quiet spin, cars passed, clouds drifted, but inside the diner, two men were learning how to speak again. They didn't need long speeches. Just the willingness to be seen without armor. Just the courage to be soft without shame. "I wasn't there when Mom died," Richard said, voice cracking. "I wanted to be. I couldn't walk into that room and face what I'd missed." Benjamin nodded, staring out the window like he was watching that same funeral all over again. "I waited at the door," he said, "hoping you'd come in." "I was there," Richard whispered. "I stood in the back. I couldn't bring myself to say anything." "I know," Benjamin replied, surprising them both. "I felt it. Didn't believe it at the time, but something told me you were close." He looked back at his son, eyes tired but steady. "I'm glad you came." Another pause. This time, it wasn't silence. It was reverence. Richard leaned back slightly, exhaling the kind of breath you release when something inside finally unclenches. "We're not gonna fix it all in one day," he said. "I know that." Benjamin gave a short nod. "No, but maybe we can start." The booth felt smaller now, not in space, but in distance. There was no more trench between them, no canyon of unspoken things. There was only a table, 2 coffees, and a moment of grace. Outside, the wind rattled the diner sign, but inside, everything held still. The storm had passed. Richard stood first. He reached out a hand, not as a test, not as a gesture, but as a bridge. Benjamin looked up at it, surprised by how familiar it felt. Then he placed his hand in his son's, letting himself be pulled gently to his feet. He moved slow, years heavier than they looked, but he stood tall. They walked toward the door together. No words. No applause. Just presence. Jenny stepped aside, her eyes glassy, offering a soft nod. Others in the diner watched, some still ashamed, some silently grateful. Not for the drama, but for the reminder that people, even broken ones, can find their way back. Richard pushed open the door and held it for his father. Benjamin paused only once, glancing back at the booth that had held him for so long, not just his body, but his silence. Then he walked forward. Out of the diner. Into the light. If you had one chance to say what was left unsaid to someone gone or someone waiting, what would you say? Leave your answer in the comments. Sometimes the words we bury are the ones that help someone else finally speak. A week later, the bell above the door still jingled the same way, but the air it let in felt different. Jenny noticed it the moment she stepped into the shift, not colder, not warmer, just heavier with memory. The floor tiles still creaked in all the same places, and the coffee still burned if you left it too long. But there was a hush now, like the walls themselves had witnessed something sacred and didn't want to disturb it. The diner wasn't just a place to eat anymore. It had become something else. The regulars came, but not quite as they were before. They greeted each other more softly. Some held the door open without thinking. Others left tips with little handwritten notes folded beside the change. And every single one of them looked, not stared, at Benjamin Walker's booth the moment they walked in. He still sat in the same spot, same black coffee in front of him, same worn jacket across the booth beside him. But now he was seen. He wasn't just the old man in the corner anymore. He was a reminder. A presence. And people noticed. Jenny had watched this shift happen slowly over the past 7 days, each moment as subtle as it was significant. The first morning after everything, she nearly cried when Benjamin nodded at her and called her Miss Jenny, like always, as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. She'd whispered, "I'm sorry," when she handed him his refill, and he'd just said, "No need, dear." But the look in his eyes, steady, soft, told her he forgave her anyway. That had been the start of something. Now when Jenny worked the floor, she felt eyes not on her, but around her, unseen, but present. Renato's men didn't sit in the booth together. They came one at a time on different days in different coats. One read the newspaper cover to cover. Another always asked for extra cream but never used it. They never said much, but their silence said everything. Protection didn't always look like bodyguards and black cars. Sometimes it looked like a man sipping coffee in the far booth with one hand on a worn leather journal. Sometimes it looked like a stranger standing a little too long by the jukebox before quietly slipping out. Jenny didn't know all their names, but she recognized the weight of loyalty when she saw it. These weren't men keeping tabs. They were keeping watch. And so the diner, once just another stop between home and work, became something else entirely. It became known. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't happen next. There was no retaliation. No police. No shouting. Just a shift. The thug never came back. Word was, he'd left town the next day, no packing, no goodbyes, just gone. Some folks said he got scared. Others said he'd been warned. Jenny didn't ask. She didn't need to. Because every time she wiped the counter, every time the bell rang, every time someone left their table cleaner than they found it, she knew the town had changed. Guilt had a way of fermenting, but here, it had transformed into something useful. The same customers who once looked away now nodded at Benjamin as they passed. Some dropped off small things: a newspaper, a fresh pastry, a tiny American flag left discreetly by the napkin holder. Benjamin never made a fuss. He simply nodded, sometimes tipped his coffee mug in silent thanks, and returned to his thoughts. He still didn't speak much. But people had learned to listen anyway. Respect doesn't need a voice when presence carries weight. Jenny found herself working with a kind of quiet purpose now. She'd always liked her job, the routine, the rhythm, but lately, it felt like something closer to stewardship. This diner had been her escape from chaos. Now it felt like a sanctuary. Not because it was untouched, but because it had been touched and still stood. One afternoon, while wiping down the menus, she noticed something tucked under the napkin holder at Benjamin's booth. It wasn't there earlier. Just a folded square of thick paper, cream-colored, no name on the outside. Benjamin noticed it too. He opened it slowly, eyes narrowing as he read the short message inside. He didn't share it. He didn't need to. But something about the way he folded it back up, carefully, reverently, told Jenny it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. A quiet one. That evening, after close, Jenny locked up the front door and lingered by the window. Outside, one of Renato's men leaned against a lamppost, smoking. He didn't look at her, didn't wave. But the moment the lights inside turned off, he flicked the cigarette, turned, and walked down the street. Jenny didn't feel watched. She felt protected. That's what had changed. The booth hadn't moved. The tables hadn't been replaced. But the diner had become something sacred again, not just because of who was sitting in it, but because of what everyone else had chosen to remember. They had remembered Benjamin. And in doing so, they had remembered themselves. The corner booth hadn't changed, same cracked cushion, same wobble in the leg, same spot where the sun hit just right around 8:10 every morning. Benjamin Walker still came in at the same time, ordered the same black coffee, and nodded at Jenny the same way he always had. But everything around him had changed. The air carried a softness now, like the diner was exhaling after years of holding something in. People noticed him, not with pity, not with distance, but with respect that didn't need to be spoken. He didn't demand it. He never had. He simply showed up, day after day, shoulders straight, presence steady. He became something more than a man in a booth. He became a reminder of endurance, of dignity, of what it means to stand for something even when your legs don't feel steady anymore. The town had shifted, too. Where silence once lived, now lived small kindnesses. Someone always held the door for Benjamin without rushing him. The morning paper was sometimes placed on his booth before he arrived. And on Fridays, someone no one ever admitted who left a small red apple on his table. Not flashy. Just thoughtful. Richard visited most Sundays. Sometimes he came with Renato, sometimes alone. He never made a scene. Just slid into the booth opposite his father, nodded, and let the conversation flow or not. They talked about small things, a game, a memory, the weather, the coffee. It was enough. The distance between them was no longer a canyon, just a table. And some weeks, Richard brought something with him, a folded newspaper, a box of pastries, or once, a worn photograph from a fishing trip neither of them had spoken about in decades. Benjamin didn't cry, but his fingers stayed on the photo longer than they needed to. That said more than words ever could. Renato never stayed long. He'd tip his hat, nod once at Benjamin, then leave a 20 beside a half-finished coffee. No fanfare, just presence. He was the kind of man who didn't need to be remembered. He made sure people wouldn't forget him without trying. Even the sheriff tipped his head when he passed him on the street. There were no more threats. No more whispers of the slap. That moment had become folklore now, the kind people spoke of with reverence, not gossip. No one wanted to be the one who forgot Benjamin Walker again. Not in this town. Jenny still worked her shifts, moving through the booths with more grace than before. She and Benjamin had an understanding now, a rhythm of service and silence that felt like mutual forgiveness. Some days, he left early. Other days, he stayed just long enough to see the first lunch orders roll in. But he always came. And the town always noticed. One morning, a man came in wearing a suit too clean for a diner that served eggs greasy and cheap. He was passing through, just looking for breakfast and directions. He slid into the booth across from Jenny's service station and scanned the room, eyes stopping at Benjamin's table. The man leaned in and asked, "That guy always sit there?" Jenny nodded, drying a cup with her towel. "Every morning." The man chuckled. "He's something, isn't he? What's his story?" Jenny glanced at Benjamin. He sat like he always did, quietly, steadily, like he had nowhere to be but still had somewhere to belong. She thought about all the things she could say, about the slap, the silence, the sun, the suits, the shame, and the salvation. But instead, she smiled, leaned in slightly, and said, "He's more than a veteran. That man once brought the Mafia to church and left with his son back." Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.